Hi everyone, welcome to The Week in Doubt, episode 37. Today's episode is brought to you by Audible.com. Get a free audiobook download at www.audibletrial.com/theweekindoubt. Over 100,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. Before we get started, I'd like to give Scott Giroux a shout out for liking the Week in Doubt Facebook page. I hope I'm getting your last name right, Giroux. Giroux? I hope it's Giroux. Anyway, my apologies if I got it wrong, but thank you very much for the support and for liking the Facebook page. Well, the first thing I'd like to do is make some quick corrections regarding last week's Halloween special. If you happen to have caught it, I hope you enjoyed it. I definitely had fun doing it. It was basically a mini audio documentary about the history of Halloween, but I still considered it an episode of The Week in Doubt. So if you missed it, you can go back and look for episode 36, and that should be it. It was actually the first episode of the show that was ever completely scripted. I'm a bit of a documentary junkie. I particularly love documentaries that have to do with world history or the history of religion, anything like that. So I felt like doing the Halloween special gave me a chance to kind of play documentarian and narrator, and I definitely enjoyed it. And so in the future, I plan on doing more things like that, probably more mini docs that have to do with the history of various holidays, or maybe that even focus on religious topics without applying my usual skeptical point of view. Maybe rather from a more academic or historical point of view. I may even do one on the history of Thanksgiving. Who knows? We'll see. But as much as I enjoyed doing the Halloween documentary, it wasn't without its errors. The first thing I got wrong was the sponsor's URL. Well, kinda. Actually, instead of just saying slash, I said backslash. And one of my fellow podcasters, the host of A Dumbass's Guide to Knowledge and the Invisible Sky Monster podcasts, a good guy and a smart guy who likes to simply go by dumbass, he filled me in that there are no backslashes in URLs. So if you tried to follow the audible.com trial URL I gave you and had any trouble, it's probably because of me. But the correct URL, which I actually gave at the beginning of this episode, is www.audibletrial.com/theweekindoubt. And as I pointed out at the beginning of the show, you can follow that URL to get a free audiobook download and to enroll in a trial membership with audible.com. So that was mistake one. Mistake two, if you can call it a mistake, is I was briefly in the Halloween episode talking about how the ancient Celts regarded the pentagram, the five-pointed star, as a fertility symbol, and they adopted the apple as a fertility symbol because they noticed that when you cut it in half, the layout of the seeds resembles a five-pointed star. Now, by dictionary definition, pentagram and pentacle are usually synonymous. But I know sometimes in occult circles, people like to differentiate them. The pentagram is often thought of as an inverted star and is associated with devil worship, and say Wiccans or neo-pagans, probably to try to avoid those negative connotations, will often, even though they're synonymous, they'll use the word pentacle, and they'll emphasize the fact that the star they use is upright. So I hope I didn't offend any Wiccans or anyone out there when I chose to use the word pentagram instead of pentacle in referring to aspects of the ancient Celtic religion. Isn't it funny how I go out of my way to apologize to the Wiccans, and yet I'm not very apologetic when I beat up on Scientologists or on Mormonism? Well, at least I'm aware of my own hypocrisy. Anyway. Okay, and the third mistake, a rather minor one, I don't even know if you can call it a mistake, it's something I just wanted to clarify. I talked about the persecution of witches in the 15th century, and I talked about the infamous book, the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of the Witches or Hammer Against Witches. And I talked about how it was penned by German clergyman Heinrich Kramer. And that is correct. And for the most part, it was almost entirely written by Heinrich Kramer. But supposedly there was another author named Jacob Sprenger who may have contributed to some small degree to the writing of the Malleus Maleficarum. But in the episode, I just, for brevity's sake, named Heinrich Kramer. And the fourth and final mistake, I hope that's it, I hope there aren't any others I haven't realized, is probably the biggest, the one I wanted to correct the most. Near the end of the Halloween special, when I get into the modern era, I talk about the rumors and paranoia concerning razor blades and apples and poisoned Halloween candy and things like that. And I described it as a paranoia that set in the 1980s. Well, it is true, as I mentioned in the special, it was in the 80s that parents had resorted to actually having their children's Halloween candy x-rayed to make sure it hadn't been tampered with. And I guess you could argue that the paranoia perhaps reached kind of fever pitch in the 80s, but there were rumors about poison Halloween candy and razor blade apples going back to the 60s, I believe. So it's basically the 60s, 70s, in the 80s is when parents started resorting, as I just mentioned, to having candy x-rayed. And then I think it may even have went into the early 90s. And it probably wasn't helped by that rash of actual poisonings that took place of products like Tylenol that you may remember hearing about in the news. Actually, I'm just reading up on it. Actually, it was back in 1982 when there was something called the Chicago Tylenol murders. Ultimately, 7 people died from ingesting intentionally poisoned Tylenol, and the murders took place during late September into early October, which should probably help explain why it fueled the poison candy hysteria. As I also mentioned in the Halloween special, it ultimately turns out that the hysteria, paranoia over the idea of poison candy or razor blades and apples, for the most part, turned out to be much ado about nothing. Although in a small handful of cases there were actual poisonings, but as sad and disturbing as it is, it usually ended up being a family member who was doing the poisoning and not a stranger. But wow, this episode is getting pretty dark, so I'll stop with the Halloween corrections for now and move on. Now, if you've been listening to the show, then you'll know that not too long ago I had been venting about a certain response I got to one of my YouTube videos. And if you do listen to the show, you'll also know that even when venting, I'm pretty laid back. Well, I took a break from looking at the status of my YouTube videos, and then I just happened to check in and notice that the same video had all of a sudden had this whole comment thread I hadn't seen before. And it had, at least at the time, about 600 and something views, which is probably the highest for any of my videos. And I know by YouTube standards, that's pretty small potatoes. But for me, I'll take it. That's pretty good. It's probably not as good as the amount of hits I get for the podcast itself. I'm not sure how much attention the podcast gets through iTunes, but I know at least through Podbean, I get something like a couple of thousand feed hits every 30 days. And once again, that's probably relatively modest in internet terms, but I'm humble enough to be very appreciative nevertheless. But anyway, this YouTube video in question that seemed to be garnering all this attention, at least significantly more in comparison to my other videos, was the YouTube version of episode 34, in which I discussed Dr. Eben Alexander and his near-death experience. And I'm actually looking at right now as I speak, it's at 701 views, 3 likes, 0 dislikes. I guess that's good. 14 comments. It's funny, I thought it was just going to be another episode. I wasn't trying to be provocative or trying to upset anyone. I was just giving my take on the story of this Harvard neurosurgeon who claimed to have had a near-death experience. And I think I even went out of my way to be as respectful as possible, to concede that no one knows for sure whether there is or isn't life after death. I even said I thought it's something that merits scientific investigation. And I even said if it's something that if someone could end up proving that life after death really did exist, it'd probably be one of the greatest discoveries in the history of mankind, if not the greatest. So, and I didn't say that glibly. I was actually being rather serious. So I went out of my way to try to be respectful, play devil's advocate against myself, and at the same time not shy away from my own skeptical views on the subject. But nevertheless, I seem to garner a fair amount of scorn. And I will say, in fairness to those who criticize me on YouTube, as always so far, they were at least somewhat respectful. No one hurled epithets or made any really serious personal attacks or, went out of their way to slander me or anything like that. The comments were rather G-rated, but it was just the thinking or lack thereof behind the comments, I think, that I take issue with. And so if you'll indulge me, I'll actually read some, if not all, the comments. And I also responded to some of them, so I'll read my own responses too. And these may be out of order to some degree. I think I'm actually reading the most recent ones first, because they're at the top of the page. And I was almost going to read this person's YouTube handle, but just to have a sense of some responsibility, I'll leave the handles out and just read the comments. And so this first comment kind of strikes me as being very Deepak Chopra-esque, but I'll read it. The Wen is like a child debating where's the North Pole. His NDE was a spiritual experience. The quote-unquote Wen is irrelevant. Unfortunately, the host doesn't realize how ignorant he sounds. We are all infinite consciousness. Everything else is an illusion. But continue laughing as a 5-year-old does. Okay. And so this one, I have to admit, I try not to take things personally, but it does get a little under my skin because he, like I said, it's still relatively G-rated, but he does border on insulting me when he says the host has no idea how ignorant he sounds. I might be a lot of things, but hopefully I'm not ignorant. I try to put a lot of thought into what I say, and I try to express myself respectfully and carefully, and I even go out of the way to play devil's advocate against my own opinions, just for the sake of fairness. So the fact that this person would kind of write me off as ignorant, it does bother me. And his claim that we're all infinite consciousness, everything else is an illusion. Well, if you're a fan of the show, you probably know that although I'm a non-believer, I'm also a fan of Eastern philosophy and religion, and even though I don't believe in the supernatural claims found in Eastern philosophy, I have great respect for some of the ideas it contains, specifically those found in Buddhism, also Hinduism, and the idea that we're all infinite consciousness and the world is an illusion. This is an idea that you can find in Hinduism, which is basically the mother religion of Buddhism. The idea that we're all a part of the body of Brahman or Brahma, that we're all one with the quote-unquote Godhead, and that the material world and the sense of self is basically illusory. And in Buddhism, even though Buddhism, in the sense, is almost an atheist religion, in that it puts emphasis on the negation of the self, and the historical Buddha supposedly thought that you couldn't find salvation with the gods, that you had to find enlightenment through negation of the self, compassion, a focus on a kind of cosmic oneness. And when you finally achieved enlightenment, you attain nirvana, basically the extinguishing of the flame, the extinguishing of the self. And that was the way you escaped samsara, the endless cycle of birth and death. So this idea about infinite consciousness, I mean, this is something you can find in Eastern religion, and it's something you find a lot in New Age thought, and that you'll hear New Age guru Deepak Chopra speak about a lot, how everything is consciousness. And it's an interesting idea. It's kind of a beautiful idea. It doesn't mean that it's empirically true. It doesn't mean it's right. It's just another spiritual idea or supposition. In the Western tradition, Christians like to believe that, unlike in Buddhism, where the goal is the negation of the self, Christians seem to like the idea that our selves live on eternally. We get reunited with family in the afterlife. We spend eternity in the presence of God. So some people believe that the individual self lives on forever. Some religions, the Eastern religions, there's a sense that the self is illusory and that you become one with the infinite or the Godhead. So these are just spiritual ideas. These aren't proven facts. So this is why I said, in response to the individual's comment, when they talked about how the when is like a child debating where's the North Pole, I said, unlike Santa's workshop, we know the brain exists, and it would certainly appear there's a direct connection between brain and consciousness. Thusly, I think the quote-unquote when is a fair question, and that's relating to during what part of Dr. Alexander's comatose near-death experience take place. Although I do a show geared towards skeptics and atheists, I always do my best to retain some degree of humility and remember that no one can prove for certain that a higher power does or does not exist. You claim that we are all infinite consciousness, but this is a supposition, not an empirical fact. So, and I noticed that, as with some of the other replies I'll read, once I kind of try to very logically and carefully counter their criticisms After that, they're nowhere to be seen. I'm not trying to brag and say that my ideas or my counter-arguments are ironclad, but I do think that they're well thought out and logical. It's funny how when I point out the flawed or superstitious nature of their comments or their propensity for wish thinking or magical thinking, it's like poof, the trolls disappear. But so I'll go down a little more. Oh, and this is one I think I already read on another episode, so I'll skip this one. This is from the guy who I think started this thread, and he was saying, why do atheists like to talk about God and religion so much? It'd be like someone who didn't believe in unicorns going around talking about unicorns all the time. And he rhetorically says, strange, huh? And I half jokingly responded to that on another episode of the show saying, you know, obviously the person's not aware of my love of mythology or fantasy. You can be fascinated or enamored with something and not believe in it literally. And I would dare say that I think a lot of people who end up losing their faith are people who have studied things like the history of religion and world history in depth. And it's part of their realization how these things, well, how religions appear to be so man-made. We can see how they borrow from one another. We can see how they evolve over time. We can see how religions and superstitious and supernatural beliefs are a dime a dozen and yet greatly varied. You know, they can't all be right. So I think it could be a love or a fascination with the study of things like religion and ancient history and mythology, folklore, things like that, that eventually end up in part leading people to be non-believers. And I'm a non-believer, but to this day, as I talked about earlier, you know, the part of the impetus for doing the Halloween special is that I'm fascinated by this stuff. I'm fascinated by history, religion, mythology. So you can have a keen interest in something without believing in it literally. And one of my favorite people, one of my favorite authors and thinkers was Joseph Campbell. And if you're familiar with him, he wrote the book The Hero with a Thousand Faces. He did that famous interview with Bill Moyers entitled The Power of Myth. And Joseph Campbell is someone who didn't believe in the supernatural claims of religion literally, but he thought that religion and myth were full of powerful symbolism. And I agree. It's kind of like epic stories like The Lord of the Rings. We obviously know they're not true. They're not meant to be taken literally. And yet, when we read them, they resonate with us. They touch us in some way. We know Gandalf isn't real. You know, we know Sauron isn't real, but they speak to us about good and evil. They speak to us about something that's inside all of us. And then also, you know, I went on to talk about how religious people, believers, shouldn't have a monopoly on the subject of religion. The big questions in life: why are we here? Is there or isn't there a God? Is there or isn't there an afterlife? These are things that all of us wrestle with to some degree. And whether you're a doubter or a believer, everyone has a right to speak about these issues, to wrestle with these issues. But anyway, so I'll skip that comment because I already went over it on another episode. Oh, and I think the way I initially replied to this person's comment is I said, "Hi, thanks for taking the time to respond to my video. Your question regarding why do atheists spend so much time talking about spiritual matters is quite valid. I can say for myself that I've been fascinated by subjects such as philosophy, religion, mythology, and ancient history since I was quite young. I would even dare to say that in a strange sense I have a love of religion. My goal isn't to try to rob others of religion, but rather to try to sort out truth from superstition." So there I'm basically reiterating everything I just blathered on about for the past 5 minutes. Maybe everything on this show should be scripted. I seem to be more eloquent when I focus on the written word rather than my stream of consciousness. But anyway, I forget which comment this lady's replying to, but she's replying to one of the other people who are trying to criticize me for my skepticism, or at least my skeptical take on Dr. Alexander's NDE story. And she says, very well said. I have heard that skeptics are so heavily in their left brain that they do not allow themselves to experience these mystical events, which is heavily right brain. It's a jealousy thing, really, and they are afraid to have such experience for fear of being proven wrong, which they are, laugh out loud. Those people of faith they mock and deride just have to apply the divine teachings. Pray for them. Oh boy. And and I promised Chris Webber from C-Web Sunday School a shout out, because when I first saw this thread, my jaw just kind of dropped, and I wanted to vent a little to some of my fellow non-believers / podcasters. So I sent a link to this thread to some of the guys, and Chris Webber made an excellent point. And he's talking about that comment where the lady's talking about left brain, right brain, lateralization, and he points out the grand hypocrisy that you have these proponents of spirituality and how the spirit can exist, or the self can exist outside the brain, or that consciousness can exist independently of the brain. And yet they're trying to explain away skepticism through brain science. The whole point of their thread was they're countering my view that we basically are our brains. Consciousness seems to be generated by the brain. If the brain becomes injured, the personality becomes injured in a sense. Different parts of the brain seem responsible for different aspects of consciousness, cognition, memory, emotion. If you injure a certain part, you get a specific result. If you damage the frontal lobe, you can wipe out parts of the personality. You can affect impulse control. So it does seem that the brain and consciousness are inextricably interconnected, and that the logical conclusion seems to be that consciousness, at least in my opinion, is an emergent property of the brain. Is it possible it could exist after the death of the brain? Perhaps. I can't rule out anything. I don't know all the answers. But the logical conclusion seems to be that consciousness is at least anchored to the brain, if not an emergent property of the brain. So they're trying to espouse the opposite view, that we're all infinite consciousness, that we're all spiritual entities, that the spirit or consciousness doesn't need the brain, and they're trying to chide me for being skeptical and saying that my skepticism is related to the brain in the anatomy of the brain. So I don't think I did Chris's critique of their hypocrisy justice, but he made an excellent point. And then the person who started the thread chimes in again. In the end, the religious fundamentalists, along with the atheists, will all have their narrow-minded beliefs shattered. There is a God, or at very least, an eternal soul and purpose to this universal life. And Christians, along with science thumpers, I guess that's a take on Bible thumpers, will all be shocked to find out how far they actually were from the truth. And so what I liked about this comment is that I agree with it in part, and yet it's another example of wish thinking. Just like the other person claimed that we're all infinite consciousness, this person claims to know, as if it's a fact, that there is a God, or at the very least, an eternal soul, and that there is a purpose to the universe and life. How can they know that? As Christopher Hitchens used to say, and this isn't verbatim, but he would say something like, "Do you possess some information that I'm not privy to?" You know, how can someone claim to know such things? And it's something I've never really tackled on the show, is the purpose of life. You know, he talks about how there is a God, or at very least an eternal soul and purpose to this universe / life. Well, he doesn't know for sure. He can't be certain that there's a God. He can't be certain that there's an eternal soul. Not even all religions guarantee an eternal soul for every individual. As far as a purpose for life, I know what it's like to go through a dark night of the soul, so to speak, to wonder what it's all about, to feel despairing, you know, to kind of stare into the void and feel the despair that comes with first getting the sinking feeling that there may not be a God, or an etched in stone purpose for us written in the stars or whatever. And I don't want to veer off too much, or because I could easily probably spend an hour or two talking about the meaning of life or the purpose of existence. I don't think that the meaning of life, obviously, since I'm a non-believer, comes from some creator, and that without that creator there is no meaning. In a sense, I think that just being alive, being a self-aware being, is inherently meaningful. The fact that we have thoughts and feelings, the fact that we seem wired for, to some degree, we're also wired for tribalism and aggression, but I think we are to some degree wired for empathy and compassion, that we're social animals. The fact that we can have bonds with our fellow Homo sapiens and with our fellow creatures, the fact that we can dream, that we can desire, that we can be moved, that we can be inspired. Somewhere in there is the meaning of life to me. And it's not an easy place to get to. You know, when you first lose your faith in a God or an afterlife, it can be very dark. And it's hard to conceive of how life could have a meaning without those things. But I think time does heal all wounds, even psychic ones, if you'll allow it to. And I know the older I get, like I've said in the show before, not only the less do I actually care if there's a God or an afterlife. For myself, at least, it's still kind of heartbreaking to think that my loved ones might die and then that's it, lights out. But for me, I fear dying. I don't want to die painfully or anything like that, but I don't fear being dead. And also, the older I get, the more I do think life is inherently meaningful. In a way, it's easy for us to assign our own meaning to life as thinking, feeling creatures with dreams, with desires, with social bonds. We might only be here briefly. Maybe there is an afterlife, maybe there isn't. Maybe, as I have been suspecting, since a young age, the less desirable of the possibilities, that it's basically lights out when we ultimately meet our end. I think even that's kind of holds a kind of poetry for me. Maybe it has something to do with my own research into Eastern philosophy, that you don't have to believe in eternal self for the self to have meaning. And there might even be a kind of beauty or poetry in the idea of being a transient being, of being a temporary being, a kind of flickering star in the universe. So this idea of the person not only claiming to know that there is a God, but that there's also a purpose, some kind of purpose to the universe, to life. I don't think there is an etched in stone purpose to existence, in the sense that I don't think there's some grand creator who gave us, who gives life meaning, who gives being alive purpose. Like I said, in a way, I think just inherent in our nature, in a way, I think just being human makes life meaningful in a way, if that makes sense. Just being a self-aware being. And secondly, I think there's also some wiggle room, I suppose, where we get to assign a purpose to our existence, where we get to assign our own purpose to our existence. Maybe one person thinks the purpose of life is trying to find scientific truth. Another person might think the purpose of life is compassion and devoting themselves to the downtrodden and less fortunate. Another person might believe there's a creator and think the purpose of life is to devote themselves to that creator. In a way, we as humans assign our own purpose to existence. But what I liked about the person's comment, and agree with it, is where he says, Christians, along with the science thumpers, will all be shocked to find out how far they actually were from the truth. And what I like about that is at least the person's willing to admit that none of us know for sure what's out there. If there is a God, if there is some universal truth, it's probably going to be considerably different than what's found in any of our man-made holy books or man-made notions of God. And the way I replied to him was, I can tell you and I have very different worldviews, but one thing I do agree with you on is that if there is a God, he, she, or it most likely differs considerably from any of our man-made concepts. Oh, and then back to the person who said that, talked about the left brain, right brain dichotomy, and basically said that atheists or skeptics are jealous because they're not able to experience mystical events, and they're afraid to have such experiences for fear of being proven wrong, which they are. And then she puts LOL in caps, but with 3 exclamation marks, no less. The way I responded to that is, because I was really offended by this one too, because it shows another ignorant assumption that you sometimes find with believers, that atheists and non-believers and skeptics don't have emotional experiences, don't have quote-unquote spiritual experiences. I'll put spiritual in quotes because obviously I doubt the existence of eternal spirit, that we don't have transcendent experiences. Christopher Hitchens used to like to use the word numinous. And I've heard people like Douglas Wilson, I think, sometimes when they hear an atheist throw about the word transcendent, they say, well, transcends what? You know, like transcendent has to refer to literally some kind of spiritual experience, when I think when atheists use the word transcendent, they mean transcend the normal mode of consciousness, transcend the normal emotional state. You know, it could be looking at art, looking at landscape, being moved by nature, being moved by music, being moved by an emotional moment with another, shared with another human being, being moved by a sudden moment of creative inspiration, or having that kind of vague feeling of the ego melting away into a sense of oneness. Those are things I think most of us experience to some degree, and you don't have to attribute them literally to a creator or to some kind of divine intervention. So the way I replied to that was, I can safely say that in my case, your characterization does not apply. I may be a skeptic, but I'm also an artist, poet, and musician. Not a day goes by that I don't find myself in some way moved or inspired. You can feel moved by art and nature, experience a feeling of oneness or heightened consciousness without blindly embracing religious dogma or superstition or believing in a man-made deity which may or may not exist. But, I usually don't toot my own horn, but reading back my own comments, I think I did a pretty good job of dismantling or exposing the fallacies in their criticisms and offering a logical, reason-based, hopefully somewhat well-worded counter-argument. And like I said, no replies once I left my retorts. And it doesn't surprise me, because I think the difference between my comments and theirs is, at least I hope, mine are well thought out, reason-based, and hopefully even somewhat respectful, giving the point that it's a counter-argument. And theirs are chock full of wish thinking, talking about religious suppositions as if they're empirical facts. One person saying we're all infinite consciousness, another person saying there's definitely a God, or at least an eternal soul. But, making these suppositions and talking about them as if they're concrete realities. So when you shine the light of reason on their magical thinking, I don't think there's a hell of a lot they can do to offer a legitimate counter-argument. You've already said the facts. You've basically said, none of us know. This is why I believe, this is what my logic and reason leaves me to believe, but I'm willing to admit, none of us know if there's really a God or not, if there's an afterlife or not. They won't do that. They claim to know for certain that there's things like infinite consciousness or a soul. Not even all religions can get on the same page about what the afterlife is like, what God is like, whether or not the eternal self survives death or we become one with the Godhead. And yet these people think they know concretely that such things exist as they conceive of them. I think it's more a case that they're trying to speak with certainty of things that they wish were so, that they hope are so, but they can't know are so, which is why they get somewhat ornery when you shine the light of reason on their ideas, or you challenge the frailty of their magical thinking. And there was one other person who I think, if not on my side, was kind of somewhere in the middle. And I'm not saying this as an insult, because I'm thankful for the person to at least in some way coming to my defense. But I'm not sure if English was their first language, or they kind of had a unique way of wording things where maybe English is their second language, but they seem to be a rather reason-based individual who was kind of taking a fair and balanced approach to the argument. Okay. So in response to one of the kind of mild criticisms that individual I mentioned, the rather logical individual offered up, the person who started the thread says, when did I ever say or even imply that the whole NDE thing doesn't need to be put to rest one way or the other? Well, in a sense, they did kind of say or imply that when they claim that there is a God, or at least an eternal soul, and they claim to know that Christians and everyone else would be in for a big surprise. So this person seems to have some knowledge of what's on the other side. But then they go on, I'm just simply stating that the jury is still out on what causes NDEs. So anyone who attempts to say that science proves NDEs to be physiological in nature is full of shit. Well, maybe this thread isn't totally G-rated after all. Because the scientific studies that have been done only further prove for now that NDEs have nothing to do with the brain. Really? NDEs have nothing to do with the brain. We already know that the dying brain experiences things like constriction of the field of vision, that certain chemicals are released in the brain that could be responsible for inducing hallucinatory events. So this idea that NDEs aren't at all linked to the brain is ridiculous. And that individual I mentioned, the more logical of the individuals involved in this comment thread, in reply to that other person, to the thread starter, said, there isn't a single formal study on NDE showing a lack of correlation, which included brain measurements at the time of NDE. So on that, you are incredibly mistaken. Where the NDE research stands is a lot like the studies of Freud. Think about it. If the brain ain't doing it, then what physical process are you studying? Claiming the brain has nothing to do with it is probably just as naive as saying the brain is still fully functioning during the NDE. And see, the person, they have their own unique way of wording things, where I got lost a little trying to follow them. But I think they make a good point about claiming the brain has nothing to do with it is probably just as naive as saying the brain is still fully functioning during NDEs. And when I did a show on near-death experiences, I even spoke relatively derisively about certain scientific theories that attempted to explain NDEs, saying that I thought, it was someone from the skeptical side of things stretching too far, and that we have to be, if we're going to find out the truth, we have to be willing to take people on both sides of the argument to task. And that I do think that some scientific explanations for NDEs are kind of far-fetched or outlandish. So I think that's a good point, that we have to be willing to look critically at both sides. I mean, claiming the brain has nothing to do with near-death experiences, or going as far as some of these other people claiming that the brain has nothing to do with consciousness. I mean, this spits in the face of reason. This is through the looking glass and down the rabbit hole. I would say it's pretty darn solidly established as scientific fact that the brain is at least in some way responsible for consciousness. The brain's an incredibly complex organ. If we don't need it for consciousness, what the heck is it doing between our ears? And why is it so darn complex? I don't mean to beat a dead horse, but like I've said repeatedly in this episode and in others, we know that different parts of the brain are responsible for different aspects of consciousness and cognition and memory and emotion. So the claim that if you're not willing to concede that consciousness is an emergent property of the brain, I mean, at least have the sanity or the clarity of thought to admit that the two, brain and consciousness, are intertwined to some degree. But on the other hand, we shouldn't accept just any half-baked theory that seems to disprove NDEs as valid spiritual experiences. And as he says, claiming the brain has nothing to do with it is probably just as naive as saying the brain is still fully functioning during an NDE. And I don't know anyone who's really claimed that the brain is fully functioning during an NDE. I think most skeptics and skeptical scientists would say that actually it's kind of the opposite. It's the impairment of the brain that's responsible for most likely responsible for the NDE, not the fact that the brain is fully functioning. It's the brain being starved of oxygen, being flooded with certain chemicals, the narrowing of the field of vision, things like that. So it's more the failing or the impairment of the brain that could be inducing near-death experiences, not trying to say that the brain is fully functioning. And I don't know if they're referencing the case of Eben Alexander, where the point of contention seems to be that he says his NDE took place at a time when his neocortex, an area of the brain responsible for higher thinking, was supposedly not functioning whatsoever, where the brain was almost dead, supposedly. And skeptics rightfully think, rightfully bring up the point, well, how do you know exactly at what point during your coma the near-death experience took place? How do you know it didn't happen as you were kind of losing consciousness or regaining consciousness? And the best that Dr. Alexander can come up with is that there were certain anchors, as he calls them, moments where maybe people were trying to talk to him and he was aware of it or something like that, and then he went back and tried to figure out, hey, when did so-and-so say what to me during the coma and things like that. But as valid as and life-changing as the experience seems for Dr. Alexander, I think it's asking a lot of us to believe in life after death, because he had an experience while his brain wasn't functioning properly. Could he have had a real valid spiritual experience that took place when his brain shouldn't have been allowing any type of higher brain activity? Maybe anything's possible. Was it also possible that this was some kind of weird hallucinatory or dream experience that he had, and he was mistaken about exactly when in the coma it took place, or was mistaken about what exactly his brain was or wasn't capable of at the time of the NDE? I think that's very possible too. And like I said, it's asking a lot of us to believe in the afterlife because of his anecdotal experience. And he is a Harvard neurosurgeon. He does know more about the human body, specifically the brain and science, than I'll probably ever know, than I could know in a few lifetimes. But he also had a very personal, private, emotional experience. And that was his experience, his anecdotal experience. And I don't think it constitutes any serious proof of life after death. It's food for thought. It's interesting. And as I said, I think the near-death phenomenon needs to continue being researched. I think it merits research. What could be more exciting or important than proving whether or not there's an afterlife? But anyway, here I am, I think, a third episode going on about Dr. Eben Alexander and his near-death experience. I'm getting a little fatigued of it. Hopefully there won't be any more YouTube responses that cause me to have to navigate this terrain again. But I'll leave it there. As always, thank you for listening to The Week in Doubt. If you like the show, you can rate us on Podbean or iTunes. You can subscribe through Podbean or iTunes. You can like the Week in Doubt Facebook page. If you want to get in touch with me, you can email theweekindoubt@gmail.com, or you can try to get in touch with me through Podbean or leave a message on the Facebook page. And sometimes I go a while without checking those things, and I apologize. But as soon as I see a message from a listener, I reply immediately. And I'm very appreciative of any interest in the show or any support. So once again, thank you very much, and goodbye for now. Until next week.